The rhythm of Evelyn's life was as predictable as the ticking of her antique clock. Each morning, she woke to the hum of her old kettle, sipping tea by the kitchen window, watching the same birds flit through the same tree branches. Her days unfolded with quiet monotony. A short walk through the park, a stack of mystery novels by her chair, and the occasional phone call with her daughter who lived states away. Evelyn had not always lived in such solitude. There had been years full of noise, laughter, and the chaos of raising children with a husband whose absence she had grown accustomed to long before the divorce papers arrived. Now, at 54, her house was her own again. It was peaceful, but it was lonely. She told herself she had made her peace with that. One drizzly Thursday, Evelyn found herself wandering the aisles of her neighborhood grocery store. She moved deliberately, ticking items off her list, bread, milk, olive oil, until she reached the produce section. As she reached for a bright yellow lemon, her hand brushed against someone else's. Startled, she turned and looked up into the warm brown eyes of a man. "Sorry about that," he said, flashing a disarming smile that revealed a faint dimple in his left cheek. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice catching slightly. His face was youthful but not boyish, framed by dark curls and a shadow of stubble that suggested he had just passed 30. His denim jacket was damp from the rain, and there was an easy confidence in his posture. "Lemons must be popular today," he joked, holding one up. Evelyn chuckled softly, surprised at how quickly he had coaxed a smile from her. It should have been an insignificant encounter, one of those fleeting moments that vanish as quickly as they appear. But Evelyn found herself lingering. He mentioned something about using the lemons for a new pasta recipe, and before she knew it, they were exchanging suggestions about herbs and wines. His name was Daniel, she learned, and he had just moved to the neighborhood. When they parted ways at the checkout, Evelyn walked to her car with a basket heavier than her grocery bags, a strange, fluttering feeling she couldn't quite name. The young man had been kind and charming, but it wasn't just his smile that lingered in her mind. It was the way he had looked at her, as though she were someone interesting, someone worth listening to. That night, as she prepared her own modest dinner, Evelyn found herself glancing at the lemon on her counter, its bright skin glistening under the kitchen light. She told herself it was silly to dwell on the moment. It was just a conversation, a pleasant distraction. And yet, for the first time in years, something about her quiet, predictable world felt ever so slightly different. Evelyn didn't expect to see Daniel again. After all, the grocery store encounter was a one-off, wasn't it? But the following week, as she reached for a box of Earl Grey on the tea aisle, there he was, pushing his cart and whistling softly under his breath. "Well, if it isn't the lemon expert," he said, catching her eye. She felt the warmth of a smile rise to her face before she could stop it. "And you must be the pasta connoisseur. How did it turn out?" "It was edible," he said mock seriously. "Could have used some pointers. Next time, I'll know to ask the expert." They laughed, and this time, their exchange lasted longer. She learned that Daniel worked at a local design firm and had recently relocated from the city in search of a slower pace. She mentioned her love of gardening, and he asked her what she thought about starting an herb patch. It was the kind of conversation that unfolded naturally, as if they'd known each other far longer than they had. Over the next few weeks, their paths continued to cross. Whether it was by coincidence or some unspoken pull, Evelyn didn't know. Sometimes they exchanged recipe ideas. Other times, they shared snippets of their lives. It was effortless, like a gentle rhythm building between them. One afternoon, as they stood in the frozen foods aisle, Evelyn found herself laughing at one of his quips, really laughing, the kind that left her feeling lighter. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the sound of her own laughter until that moment. "Do you always shop on Thursdays?" he asked suddenly, his tone curious. "Well, it's become a bit of a habit," she admitted. "Why?" "No reason. I just seem to have excellent timing," he said with a wink. After that, she noticed a shift. When they spoke, his focus was unwavering. He asked about her week, her hobbies, her past. He noticed things others didn't, like the small gold locket she wore around her neck or the way her face lit up when she talked about her garden. And in turn, she started looking forward to their chats in a way she hadn't anticipated. Once, when she mentioned that she'd been craving good coffee, Daniel lit up. "There's a cafe downtown with the best cappuccinos you'll ever taste," he said. "You should try it." "Maybe I will," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of shyness. "You know," he added, "I could show you. If you'd like." Evelyn hesitated for a moment, her pulse quickening. It was such a simple offer, yet it carried an unexpected weight. "All right," she said finally. "Why not?" They met the following Saturday at the cafe he had recommended. It was a small, cozy place with mismatched furniture and the aroma of freshly ground beans filling the air. Over steaming mugs of cappuccino, their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from their favorite books to the quirks of small-town life. By the time they parted ways, Evelyn felt a fullness in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Daniel's easy humor and genuine interest in her life had brought something unexpected into her world, a sense of connection that had been absent for far too long. That night, as she replayed their conversation in her mind, she couldn't help but smile. She told herself it was nothing more than a pleasant friendship, a harmless reprieve from the monotony of her days. And yet she couldn't deny it. Daniel had become the brightest spot in her week. It began with a flicker, a sensation Evelyn couldn't quite name. A warmth lingered long after her encounters with Daniel, like the afterglow of a summer evening. She brushed it off at first, telling herself it was nothing more than gratitude for his kindness and attentiveness. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. One evening, while trimming the lavender bushes in her garden, Evelyn caught herself humming a melody. It wasn't until she paused, hands still, that she realized the tune was the same one Daniel had been whistling the day they met. The realization startled her. Was it possible he had left such a mark on her mind? The pivotal moment came a week later. She was at the grocery store again, this time alone. As she reached for a box of cereal, she suddenly found herself smiling, imagining what Daniel might say about her choice. "That's not breakfast, it's dessert," he teased, pointing out the chocolate chunks on the box. Her laughter echoed softly in the aisle, startling her. It wasn't just his humor or the way he listened. It was how he made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't felt in years. For so long, her days had been a blur of solitude and routine. And yet, in those brief moments with Daniel, she felt alive, as though someone had thrown open a window in a dusty, quiet room. That realization both thrilled and terrified her. It wasn't long before the feelings she had been trying to ignore became impossible to suppress. One afternoon, while sipping tea on her porch, Evelyn allowed herself to think about him without restraint. She imagined his boyish grin, the way his green eyes sparkled when he spoke passionately about something. She thought of the subtle brush of his arm against hers as they walked side by side outside the cafe. And then, it hit her a sharp, undeniable truth. She was falling for him, a man who, by all accounts, was much younger than she was. Her first instinct was panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was 54, with streaks of silver in her hair and a life firmly planted in the predictable. She had long resigned herself to the idea that her chance at love had passed. The notion of feeling something so vibrant, so electrifying, was as unexpected as it was unsettling. But the fear wasn't just about her own emotions. What would people think? A woman her age, entertaining such thoughts about a man young enough to be her son? It was unthinkable. The world, she knew, would not be kind. Evelyn spent the next few days oscillating between hope and doubt. She told herself it was fleeting, a harmless infatuation born out of loneliness. Yet the more she tried to suppress it, the more it consumed her. She began to notice every detail about him with newfound clarity. The timbre of his voice, the way his presence filled a room, even the small dimple in his cheek when he smiled. One evening, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Evelyn whispered aloud to the stillness of her room, "This can't be real." But her heart knew better. The next morning, as she got dressed and prepared for her day, she caught her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, she lingered, studying herself with fresh eyes. She smoothed her blouse, adjusted her necklace, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She looked older, yes, but there was something else, a flicker of light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It terrified her, and yet, it made her feel alive. Evelyn's heart had become a battlefield of emotions. As much as she cherished the moments she spent with Daniel, she couldn't ignore the doubts clawing at the edges of her mind. Every morning, she woke with a rush of excitement at the thought of possibly seeing him again. But by evening, the fear of judgment clouded her joy. What would her neighbors think if they saw her with him? What would her grown children, both living their lives miles away, say if they knew their mother was captivated by a man half her age? The internal conflict was relentless. One afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of tea in her hands, replaying their recent conversations in her mind. He had talked about his ambitions, his love for photography, and the way he dreamed of traveling to Iceland to photograph the northern lights. Evelyn admired his passion, his zest for life that seemed untainted by cynicism. But then she'd hear the voice of self-doubt. He could never feel the same way about me. Why would he? She imagined him with someone his age, vibrant and full of potential. What could she possibly offer him? She had lived her life, he was just beginning his. The weight of these thoughts grew heavier when she went out in public. She'd find herself hyper-aware of glances, wondering if strangers could see the way her eyes lingered on Daniel when he wasn't looking. Did they notice how her smile brightened around him? One evening, she confided in her best friend, Martha, over the phone. Martha was the only person Evelyn trusted with her secret, and even then, it took her nearly an hour of rambling to get to the point. "There's someone I've been spending time with," Evelyn began hesitantly, twisting the phone cord in her fingers as though it could anchor her. "He's younger. Much younger." "How much younger?" Martha's voice was cautious but kind. "Almost 30, Evelyn admitted, bracing for a gasp that never came. There was a pause. Then Martha said gently, "Does he make you happy?" Evelyn's throat tightened. "Yes, but it's ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, what could he possibly see in me?" "Evelyn," Martha said firmly, "don't do this to yourself. Love doesn't come with rules about age or timing. If he makes you happy, maybe that's all that matters." Those words lingered with Evelyn long after the call ended, but they didn't silence her fears. She still wrestled with the realities of their differences. She worried about the life experiences that separated them, about the paths they were on. So different, so far apart. Yet for every doubt, there was a moment that made her heart flutter. Like the time he'd taken her hand absent-mindedly while helping her navigate a crowded parking lot, his touch warm and natural. Or the time he'd texted her a photo of a blooming sunflower he'd seen on his walk, simply captioned, "Made me think of you." Her emotions were a tangled knot. Hope, fear, desire, and disbelief all intertwined. At times, she wanted to push him away, to spare herself the inevitable heartbreak she was convinced would come. But every time she tried to imagine a life without him, it felt unbearably dull, like slipping back into a world without color. One afternoon, as she sat on a park bench watching a group of children chase a kite, she allowed herself to wonder, what if I let myself feel this? What if I stopped worrying about what people thought and just lived? The thought was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, Evelyn began to entertain the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to feel this kind of happiness again. The idea took root slowly, like a hesitant bud breaking through the soil after a long winter. Evelyn found herself thinking more and more about creating an opportunity to deepen her connection with Daniel, something beyond their fleeting grocery store conversations and the occasional coffee outing. One Friday morning, while arranging flowers in a vase, she caught herself rehearsing the invitation in her head. She laughed at her reflection in the kitchen window, feeling like a giddy teenager instead of a woman in her 50s. But the thought wouldn't leave her. It was time to step out of her comfort zone. The following afternoon, while Daniel was helping her load a heavy bag of cat food into her trunk, a gesture he'd insisted upon, she took a breath and said, "You know, I've been meaning to try out this new pasta recipe. Would you like to come by for dinner sometime? You're always talking about how much you love Italian food." His face lit up in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Are you kidding? I'd love that. When were you thinking?" Evelyn stammered for a moment, surprised by how easy he made it. "Oh, maybe tomorrow evening? Around 7. Perfect. Should I bring anything?" "No, just yourself," she said, managing a smile despite the whirlwind of nerves swirling inside her. As she drove home, her excitement was quickly overtaken by anxiety. She hadn't entertained anyone in years, let alone a man like Daniel. The mere thought of him walking through her door felt monumental. What would he think of her home, her decor, the little touches that reflected her quiet, solitary life? She spent the rest of the day preparing, using the nervous energy to channel her focus. She picked out the perfect tablecloth, one her late mother had embroidered, and lit a candle that smelled faintly of lavender. She pulled out an old cookbook and carefully selected a recipe she knew she could master. Homemade pasta with creamy tomato sauce, a classic but comforting choice. The following day passed in a blur. Evelyn fussed over every detail, from the way the napkins were folded to the wine she selected. A bottle she'd been saving for a special occasion. And wasn't this special? She told herself it was, though a tiny voice in the back of her mind questioned what she was hoping to achieve. Was this dinner an innocent gesture between friends, or was it something more? Did she even know? By 6 o'clock, the house was ready, and Evelyn had just enough time to change into a soft, midnight blue dress that accentuated her figure without feeling too formal. As she stared at her reflection, she hardly recognized herself. There was a glow to her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes she hadn't seen in years. At precisely 7, the doorbell rang. Evelyn's heart leapt, and for a moment, she considered pretending she wasn't home. But she shook off the irrational thought, smoothed the front of her dress and opened the door. Daniel stood there, holding a bouquet of sunflowers that matched the warmth of his smile. "I thought these might go with your sunflower mug," he said with a playful wink. Evelyn laughed, touched by the gesture. "They're perfect. Come in." As he stepped inside, she felt the weight of her nerves lift slightly. He seemed at ease, admiring the little details of her home with genuine curiosity and offering compliments that felt sincere. "This place is so cozy," he said, running a hand along the bookshelf in her living room. "It feels like you?" His words warmed her more than they should have, and as she led him to the dining table, she found herself daring to hope. This evening was more than just a meal. It was a chance to see what might blossom between them, unencumbered by the world outside. When he pulled out her chair and sat across from her, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on his face, Evelyn realized she had made the right decision. No matter where this night would lead, she had taken a step forward. She had chosen to let someone in, and that, in itself, felt like a triumph. Dinner was a blur of laughter, conversation, and the comforting rhythm of a shared meal. The homemade pasta turned out better than she had hoped, and Daniel was a gracious guest, praising every bite. They traded stories, his of traveling through Europe, her of raising her children, of the quiet life she'd built in the years since. There was a sense of ease between them, as though the gap in their years had dissolved in the warmth of the room. But it was when the wine was nearly gone and the plates were cleared that something shifted. As the evening stretched on, the atmosphere between them deepened. They moved from the dining table to the living room, where the conversation turned to less safe topics: love, regret, and the passage of time. Daniel, who had been so open and candid all evening, now leaned back on the couch, his eyes reflecting the soft light from the lamp beside them. "I don't really know how to explain it," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "But you make me feel like I'm seen. Like there's more to life than what I thought it was." Evelyn felt a stirring in her chest, an unfamiliar warmth. She wasn't sure what it was, but she recognized the same feeling she had when she first met him. A spark of something unexpected, something she couldn't quite grasp but didn't want to let slip away. "You make me feel that way too," she replied, her voice softer than usual, vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in years. "Like I'm not invisible, like I matter." For a moment, there was silence between them. She could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the gentle hum of the city outside. The weight of their words hung in the air, settling into the space between them. Daniel shifted closer, and without thinking, Evelyn found herself leaning into him. The proximity felt natural, comfortable even, but it also sent a tremor through her, an electric current she hadn't anticipated. She caught herself holding her breath, unsure of how to proceed, of what exactly she was feeling. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "You know, I've never been good at hiding what I feel. And right now, I'm feeling something. Something strong." Evelyn's heart raced. She had heard that tone before, the one that signaled the beginning of something that could change everything. And in that moment, she realized that she felt the same way, that her own feelings had grown beyond friendship, beyond the quiet acceptance she had convinced herself was enough. She had tried to keep her emotions in check, to avoid letting her heart run ahead of her, but now, in the dim light of her living room, it felt impossible to ignore. She turned toward him, meeting his gaze. The connection between them felt like a pull, magnetic, undeniable. Slowly she reached out, her hand brushing against his. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt the familiar spark of desire, a longing that was as new as it was familiar. It wasn't the kind of passionate kiss she might have imagined in the past, but it was something deeper, more tender. When their lips met, it was soft, hesitant at first, as though both of them were testing the waters, afraid to make a misstep. But as the kiss deepened, Evelyn's fear began to melt away. The world outside her little home ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, two people who had found something in one another that neither had expected, but both had been yearning for. When they finally broke apart, her breath was shallow, and she found herself smiling, as though waking from a dream. "I didn't think this would happen," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Neither did I," Daniel said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "But here we are." And in that moment, Evelyn knew that this night would mark a turning point in her life. The relationship they were building, the connection that had begun so innocently in the grocery store, had become something more. Something real. The days that followed were filled with a kind of wonder Evelyn had almost forgotten was possible. As she awoke each morning, there was a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, an anticipation that had long been absent from her life. It was as though she was living in a world of her own creation, one where age and the heavy judgments of society no longer held sway over her. The future seemed open to her now, in a way it hadn't in years. She was learning to listen to her heart again, to feel desire without shame. But even as she reveled in the newness of this connection with Daniel, there were moments when doubt crept in, whispering from the edges of her mind. She was not a young woman anymore, not in the way he was. The world was quick to remind her of that, in subtle ways, comments made by friends, glances from strangers who couldn't help but notice the difference in their ages. Evelyn had always known she was perceived differently by the world. This was just another layer of that truth. She thought about it during the quiet moments, when Daniel wasn't with her, when she could allow herself to be still. She thought about how, for most of her life, she had conformed to the role society expected her to play. Mother, wife, caretaker. She had followed the script, playing each part to perfection, until she was left with little more than the echoes of what she'd once been. And yet, with Daniel, there was no script. There was no expectation other than the one they created together. And that, she realized, was what made it so extraordinary. Her thoughts would often drift to the moments they shared. The way his eyes lit up when he spoke of his dreams. The way he seemed to listen to her as though everything she said mattered. As if she had something to offer beyond the years she had lived. He saw her. Truly saw her. Not as the woman of a certain age, but as someone whose experiences had shaped her in ways that were valuable, meaningful. The joy he found in her company was a reminder that love was not limited by age, but by the willingness to be open and vulnerable. One afternoon, as they sat together in the small park near her apartment, Daniel turned to her, his hand resting casually on hers, and said, "I think about how much I've learned from you. You make me realize that life isn't just about the things we're told to chase. It's about the connections we make. And I'm really glad we found each other." Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet recognition that what they shared wasn't just fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something that could stand the test of time. "I'm glad too," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I never thought I'd find someone who could make me feel like this again. It's been a long time since I've felt truly seen." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words lingering in the air. Evelyn reflected on how far she had come since that first, simple encounter in the grocery store. There was no longer a need to hide or to apologize for what was blooming between them. She was learning, slowly but surely, that it was okay to let go of the fears that had held her back for so long. She had spent much of her life trying to reconcile the expectations placed on her with her own desires. Now she was beginning to understand that real love, had no age, no time limits. It was fluid, evolving, and endlessly complex. Love didn't ask for permission to exist, it simply was. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn allowed herself to feel it, fully and without hesitation. As she looked at Daniel, The weight of the past seemed to lift, leaving her free to embrace what was happening between them. There was no script to follow, no judgment to worry about. Just a simple truth. They were here together, and that was enough. She smiled, reaching out to take his hand more firmly in hers. "You've made me believe in something I didn't think I would ever believe in again," she said softly. "And for that I'm so grateful." Daniel squeezed her hand, his gaze warm and steady. "I'm grateful too. More than I can say." In that moment, Evelyn knew that love, at any stage of life, had the power to transform. And she was ready to embrace it fully, without fear or reservation. As the weeks passed, Evelyn felt herself changing in ways she had never anticipated. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but the quiet, steady growth of something profound between her and Daniel became undeniable. Their connection was not bound by the expectations of others, nor by any conventional timeline. It was a relationship that bloomed organically, nurtured by shared moments, mutual respect, and the freedom to be completely themselves in each other's presence. She still had moments of doubt, fleeting thoughts that wondered if the world would ever truly accept them. There were still times when she caught herself overthinking, second-guessing the choices she had made. But those moments were growing fewer and farther between. In their place, there was a quiet confidence, a certainty that love was not just for the young or the newly blossomed. It was for anyone who dared to be vulnerable, to open their heart without regard for what others might think. Evelyn had come to realize that, for all the years she had spent defining herself by external roles, mother, wife, daughter, there was a more fundamental truth about who she was, one that had nothing to do with the passage of time. Love had always been within her reach, and now, with Daniel, she was learning that it was never too late to rediscover it. There were no age limits on what the heart could feel, no restrictions on how deeply one could connect with another soul. With Daniel, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. He brought back the curiosity, the playfulness, the openness that had been buried beneath the years of routine and responsibility. And in the quiet moments, the moments when they sat together on the porch or shared a meal in the warmth of her kitchen, Evelyn found herself reflecting on just how far she had come. This relationship, this unexpected bond, was teaching her to embrace life anew, to let go of the past without regret and welcome the future with open arms. She thought about the friends who would, no doubt, raise their eyebrows, the well-meaning family members who might try to protect her from what they perceived as a risk. But Evelyn had learned to trust her instincts. The life she had built, the quiet solace of her days, no longer felt like a limitation but a foundation, one from which she could grow and evolve, both as an individual and in her relationship with Daniel. And so, she made a quiet promise to herself, to never again shrink from what her heart desired. Age was a number, and time was a construct. What mattered now was the space they had created for each other, the joy they shared, and the love that had unexpectedly come into her life. She smiled as she thought about the future, not with fear but with a sense of possibility. Love, after all, was timeless, and it had found its way to her once more. As they walked hand in hand into the days ahead, Evelyn knew that what mattered most was not the years that separated them, but the love they had found in each other. In the end, that was all that would ever matter.